Pteranodon. Africa produced monsters. Most people know the ones from the north, the predators, the giants, the things that left bones big enough to fill museum halls. But Africa had a stranger secret buried further south, and for nearly a century after its discovery, nobody could agree on what it even was. Pulled from the rock formations of what is now the eastern Cape of South Africa, in layers dating somewhere between 136 and 131 million years ago, scientists found something that didn't fit any clean category. Something that had been waiting in the ground since before most of the dinosaur lineages anyone recognizes had even evolved. Its name is Pteranodon africanus. It was collected in 1845. It wouldn't be correctly identified as a stegosaur until 1929, not because the science wasn't there, but because the fossils were so fragmentary that even expert examination produced the wrong answer for 84 years. That misidentification isn't a footnote. It's the central fact about this animal. When Andrew Geddes Bain shipped the specimen to England in the mid-19th century, the naturalists who examined it described it broadly as a plant-eating reptile and moved on. No one was being careless. The fossil material genuinely did not contain enough diagnostic information to place the animal correctly. A partial upper jawbone, a few teeth, scattered fragments. That is not a dataset. That is a suggestion. And suggestions in Victorian paleontology frequently got filed and forgotten. Pteranodon sat in that limbo for nearly a century before someone looked at the tooth morphology carefully enough to recognize what the shape of those denticles actually implied. What makes Pteranodon's teeth distinctive, and here's the detail nobody mentions when they skip past this animal, is their structure. Laterally compressed, leaf-shaped, with serrated edges built not for grinding or crushing, but for shearing, for cutting through resistant material with precision. One feature preserved in a jaw fragment that tells us more about how this animal processed food than a dozen bones from the wrong part of the skeleton ever could. Cretarosaurus, England, 1874. A single vertebra. That is the entire known fossil record of Cretarosaurus pottenensis. One bone from the Potten Sands of Bedfordshire, approximately 130 million years old. And science has a specific technical term for what that means. Nomen dubium. A doubtful name, not informal skepticism, not a minority opinion. A formal designation used when fossil material is so limited that the species cannot be reliably distinguished from other known animal, and therefore cannot be confirmed to exist as a distinct taxon at all. That is the current standing of Cretarosaurus, not a confirmed stegosaur, not a confirmed species, a name attached to a bone that may or may not represent something new, sitting in the literature because removing it entirely would require evidence that from one vertebra nobody can produce. The name means bowl lizard. The reason for it is a distinctive hollow on the top surface of the neural arch, a depression that, when Richard Lydekker formally examined the specimen in 1889, reminded him of the vertebrae of Stegosaurus closely enough that he placed it in the same family. Subsequent researchers looking at the same bone over the following decades were considerably less certain. The morphological similarity Lydekker identified as real. Whether it indicates genuine stegosaur affinity or simply reflects shared features present in multiple ornithischian groups is something one vertebra cannot resolve. Here's what that single bone can tell us, even in isolation. By the time this animal, whatever it was alive, stegosaurs were in serious trouble. England at this period was not a continuous landmass. It was a scattered chain of semi-tropical islands, seasonally flooded, geologically unstable. Whatever left that vertebra in the Potten Sands was living at the edge, geographically, temporally, and in terms of its group's survival. One of the last members of a declining dynasty on literal islands, in rock formations that have so far yielded exactly one bone. Zhangjunosaurs. The Yungar Basin of Xinjiang, northwestern China, is one of the most productive dinosaur sites on Earth. Excavations there have pulled up a staggering variety of late Jurassic animals with no close relatives anywhere in the northern hemisphere record. Among them, described formally in 2007, it was Zhangjunosaurus jungarensis, a stegosaur from roughly 161 to 155 million years ago, carrying an anatomical detail that nobody expected and that quietly reframes how the group diversified across Asia. The fossils include vertebrae, limb elements, and portions of the dermal plates. And here's what stopped researchers when they examined them. On most stegosaurs, the dorsal plates are broad and flattened, structures clearly modified for display, thermoregulation, or species recognition. On Zhangjunosaurus, the recovered plates are narrower, more conical, more spine-like in their proportions. Not fully plates, not fully spines. On something sitting precisely at the anatomical midpoint between two different evolutionary strategies, a form that had never been documented at that exact intermediate stage in any previously described stegosaur. That intermediate morphology is significant beyond being unusual. It suggests that the transition between plate-dominated and spine-dominated body plans, a transition that happened multiple times across different stegosaur lineages, passed through a recognizable intermediate stage, and that Zhangjunosaurus preserves a snapshot of what that stage looked like. That is the kind of data point that redraws evolutionary trees, if the fossil material were more complete. The Shishugo Formation, where this animal lived, was a semi-arid landscape threaded with rivers and seasonal floodplains, dense with the tough vegetation that Jurassic herbivores had to consume in enormous quantities. The giant theropod Sinraptor was present in the same environment. At around 7 meters long, Zhangjunosaurus was large enough to deter casual predation from most animals. But Sinraptor was not a casual predator. Gigantospinosaurus. Most stegosaurs are defined by what's on their backs. Gigantospinosaurus sequinensis made a fundamentally different architectural choice, and the result is one of the strangest silhouettes in the entire dinosaur record. And the anatomical discovery it produced is one that changes how the whole group is understood. Described in 1992 from the Shaximiao Formation of Sichuan Province, China, and dating to approximately 160 million years ago, Gigantospinosaurus carries a pair of massive lateral spines projecting outward from the shoulder region. Not decorative projections, not subtle modifications. Enormous, sweeping structures, proportionally larger relative to body size than the shoulder spines on any other known stegosaur. The anatomy that gives the animal its name, giant-spined lizard, is not an exaggeration, but the detail that matters most is what those giant shoulder spines came at the cost of. The dorsal plates of Gigantospinosaurus, the back structures that define every other member of the group, are actually smaller than those of most relatives. Significantly smaller. This animal evolved massive shoulder projections while simultaneously reducing its back plating. It traded investment in one structure for investment in another. And that trade-off tells us something that changes how stegosaur anatomy has to be interpreted. The back plates and the shoulder spines were not a single integrated system, fixed in proportion. They were two separate systems that evolution could dial independently, one up, one down, in response to different pressures. Gigantospinosaurus is the specimen that makes that separability visible. At 4 to 4.5 meters in length, this was a compact herbivore in a landscape shared with the sauropod Omesaurus and the theropod Yangchuanosaurus. Those outward projecting shoulder spines would have made the animal appear wider than its actual body, a visual deterrent that cost nothing in terms of body mass, but substantially changed how a predator had to calculate an approach vector. Combined with residual dorsal plating and a spiked tail, Gigantospinosaurus was a small stegosaur that presented a large problem. Chungkingosaurus. Here is something nobody tells you about stegosaur back structures. The plates, like the defining feature of the entire group, the reason the name means roof lizard, were not a fixed design. They varied. They changed shape, changed size, changed apparent function across different species in ways paleontologists are still mapping. And Chungkingosaurus zhongbaiensis, one of the smallest stegosaurs ever found, carries a version of that feature so far outside the typical form that it forces a question nobody has cleanly resolved. Where exactly does a plate end and a spine begin? Found in the Shaximiao Formation of Chongqing, China, dating to roughly 160 to 155 million years ago, Chungkingosaurus was approximately 3 to 4 meters long and weighed somewhere around 150 to 200 kilograms. Small by stegosaur standards, its back structures were narrow, conical, and spike-like, more pointed than plated, more weapon-shaped than the broad display structures seen on larger relatives. An animal that looked, in profile, fundamentally unlike the stegosaur archetype, despite belonging unmistakably to the group. What makes that anatomical difference genuinely interesting is who it was living next to. Chungkingosaurus shared the Shaximiao Formation with Tuojiangosaurus, another stegosaur, same time, same place, same general environment. Two species of the same group coexisting in one ecosystem with meaningfully different armor configurations. That coexistence is not accidental. It is evidence of ecological partitioning. Two related animals that had diverged enough in their defensive and display strategies that they were not directly competing with each other's solutions to the same problems. Different armor, different browsing height, different predator deterrence profile. The same landscape used differently. Tuojiangosaurus. This is the one that should be famous, and understanding exactly why it isn't reveals something important about how scientific knowledge actually travels, or fails to. Tuojiangosaurus multispinus, Tuo river lizard, many-spined, is the most completely known stegosaur ever found in Asia. Two partial skeletons, together representing more than half the animal's total anatomy, excavated from the Upper Shaximiao Formation in Zigong, Sichuan Province in 1977. Formally described, studied, mounted, and displayed in Chinese natural history museums, where it has stood for decades. By every standard measure of fossil completeness and scientific documentation, one of the best understood stegosaurs on Earth. The gap is not scientific. The fossils are real, the documentation is thorough, and the research has been published. The gap is one of reach. The animal is extensively known within Chinese paleontology and almost invisible outside it. That is not a flaw in the science. It is a consequence of how paleontological narratives get established, repeated repeated and exported globally. Stegosaurus became the archetype because it was found in North America in the 19th century, described in English, and embedded into museum culture at the moment those institutions were actively shaping public understanding of prehistoric life. Stegosaurus was described a century later, in a different country, in a different language, at a moment when the global template for what a stegosaur looked like had already been set. Catching up to a century-old head start is genuinely difficult, regardless of how good the fossils are.